Okay, it looks like everyone is seated, so we'll begin the second panel of the conference, and the topic of this panel is Women and the Law, and it, I think, will pick up, as you will see very nicely, on some of the topics that were discussed earlier this morning on the domestic violence panel. I am the moderator. My name is Julie Surs. I'm an attorney here in Missoula. Prior to being an attorney and prior to moving to Missoula, I was also involved internationally, particularly, not as an attorney, however, but particularly in countries such as Afghanistan and Pakistan. Our first speaker today is Matthew Fletcher, who's a professor of law at Michigan State University College of Law. He's there also the director of Indigenous Law and Policy. He is also the Chief Justice of the Porch Band of Creek Indians Supreme Court and sits as an appellate judge for the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians, and the Hoopa Valley Tribe and the Nottawasepi Huron Band of Potawatomi Indians. And I apologize for those mispronunciations. He was helping me, but I don't think I quite got it down. In 2010, Professor Fletcher was also elected to the American Law Institute. He's a member of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians. And if you will please join me in welcoming Professor Fletcher. Thank you.
I'm going to skip up everything. Thanks, Julie. You skipped over Peshabi Town, which I see is in the program, so don't worry about that. Nobody in Peshabi Town knows how to pronounce it either. All right, bonjour, my name is Matthew Fletcher. I'm an Anishinaabe from Michigan, and so it's nice to be here in Montana. A little bit out of my element. I do teach American Indian law, constitutional law, lawyers and ethics. My wife also does much of the same work that I do, and perhaps she would be a better speaker for this, but perhaps I can offer some insights as well. And I'm pleased to see that you had Leslie Hagen in the previous panel. She's been doing just amazing work over a long period of time for Indian country, particularly for American Indian women. And she may or may not have mentioned, and I'm sorry to say that I missed her panel, that American Indian women are, and other women in Indian country suffer incredible amounts of physical violence against them, criminal activities. That's just really completely disgusting in any way. And when you have Amnesty International reports about the lack of the federal government response to rapes and domestic violence in Indian country, that there's something really serious going on. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm going to use that as a jumping off point to more of a discussion of American Indian women in Indian country and as a traditional historical matter and what's going on now. So as you may have heard, you know, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of violence in Indian country. And what's interesting about all this is that, and if you ever get a chance to read a book on this subject, I urge you to take a look at a book by a woman named Andrea Smith, who wrote a book called Sexual Conquest, which historicizes what has happened to Indian country in the context of American Indian women. Conquest, historically, going back hundreds, if not thousands of years, is really about taking control of your opponents, your victims, women, and their children. And you know, the classic paradigmatic case has to be the United States, and the previous European nations that were here just did an unbelievable job in destroying American Indian women's culture and tradition and their place in many Indian societies. And I should add, there are 566 federally recognized tribes and probably a couple dozen others that have a pretty good claim that may or may not become federally recognized someday. And all of the cultures are different to some extent. They're not, and so it's hard to make broad generalizations. But what I will say is that there's no doubt that in the vast majority of these indigenous populations prior to contact, American Indian women occupied, if not a higher place, certainly an equal place in the government and politics and the economics of what we now call Indian country. There's no doubt, and nobody can seriously challenge that. And what is also of no doubt is that when United States and other European nations began to impose their will on Indian country, one of the first things they did was to, establish the patriarchy. And maybe they didn't do it intentionally, but I think my sense is the cultures from Europe are very, particularly the conquering cultures from Europe, are very patriarchal, very militaristic. And so you see a lot of cultures losing that. There's the guy who's the current president of the Seneca Nation of Indians, used to be a law professor. His name is Rob Porter. Very iconoclastic guy. And he wrote papers in the 90s describing in great detail and very persuasively exactly what happened at his tribe, the Seneca Nation, and also some of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee tribes. They would have meetings, international meetings amongst the 5 or 6 nations where mostly men were sitting around the fire, but those men were they were tools of the women who were sitting in the back. And if there was any decision to be made, you'd see a bunch of guys standing up and going back and conferring with the clan mothers. No decision could be made without those women. That was all replaced when the tribe in 1848 adopted a constitution and that was written in English that created a council and a legislature and a president, and they, only men were elected and only men made the decisions. And it took a long time for that tradition of of conferring with the clan mothers, but it was effective over time when you have the written structure. That happened innumerable times around Indian country, to the point where I think you can safely trace a historic lineage between that structure, the traditional and customary governmental structure, to the epidemic of violence against Indian women in Indian country and elsewhere too. But there is a lot of interesting things going on. Tribal sovereignty is alive and well, and these 566 federally recognized tribes have the right to govern themselves, and the United States Supreme Court has recognized that right, although, and this is sort of a footnote, there is an element of misogyny to that recognition. Sovereignty is, in some ways, I guess you could say, as a theoretical matter, misogynist. In 1978, probably the biggest and most important case on tribal sovereignty the Supreme Court ever decided is called Santa Clara Pueblo versus Martinez. And Martinez was Julia Martinez and her kids. And the Santa Clara Pueblo had a rule that they adopted at the encouragement of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the 1930s that if you were a man and a member of the tribe and you married outside the tribe and have kids, your kids can be members of the tribe. So if a Santa Clara Pueblo member married a Navajo woman or had kids with a Navajo woman, their kids would be eligible for membership. Conversely, it wasn't true if you were a woman. So Julia Martinez, who married a Navajo man and had kids, her kids were ineligible. It didn't matter how much Indian blood they have. And you can't get a more sexist, obviously a more sexist and misogynist rule. And the Supreme Court said the tribe has the right to determine for itself its own membership criteria. They recognize tribal sovereignty. And boy, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? And if you've ever heard of a fantastically famous and influential and also very controversial, my favorite law professor from U of M, Michigan, excuse me, not U of M, Montana, Catherine McKinnon wrote a paper about it and actually gave us a talk that was transcribed in the 1980s saying this is, the only time the Supreme Court has recognized tribal sovereignty is at the expense of a woman and her children. There's something to be said about that, but it's an important precedent nonetheless. And a couple of years back, we had a conference where we invited a bunch of Indian women who were tribal leaders, tribal judges, and one woman who is similarly situated to Julia Martinez. Her name is Rena Swensel, from the Santa Clara Pueblo, who had kids who were not eligible for membership. And we sat and we lined them up and asked them about what they thought about Martinez. And Catherine McKinnon was in the room. And every single one of them strongly supported the Supreme Court's decision in favor of tribal sovereignty. And Rena Swensel, who had said it before, repeated what she had said, which was, this is not for the Supreme Court, which then was 9 old white men, to decide for us even then. We'll fix it. It may take time. And in fact, that rule hasn't changed. But the political process there is working, and it is being run by women in many ways. And this is happening throughout Indian country. I should add that the Santa Clara Pueblo rule sounds really awful, but you remember the Seneca Nation of Indians? They have the exact opposite rule. If you are a Seneca man and you marry outside the tribe, your kids can't be members. And that's actually, that rule is more prevalent in Indian country. There are only a few dozen tribes that have something like that, but the New York tribes pretty much exclusively have that rule. So there are these rules relating to tribal sovereignty that affect women. And, but women, the American Indian women, generally speaking, are in support of tribal sovereignty because there is such a direct connection between this space, this political and legal space that we call tribal sovereignty, and the preservation of the culture, and the restoration of the culture, and the adaptation of the culture to what is around us as Indian people. This, so what some people call a dominant society, but what you can just say pushy society would work. So that leads us to a few other things that are going on, which I think are very interesting. Several years ago, my wife and I were thinking about writing a law review article on same-sex marriage in Indian country because a woman showed up with her partner at the Cherokee Nation courthouse and asked for a marriage certificate. And the court clerk, and mind you, this is Oklahoma, the court clerk says, "Wow, I have no idea what to do with this." But their marriage license was gender neutral. So their marriage ordinance was gender neutral. So she said, "You could have it. I don't know if we're going to recognize it." And multiple lawsuits followed, which never really has come to a resolution at Cherokee. Around the same time, the same thing had happened at Navajo. They passed a statute quickly that was purporting to ban same-sex marriage. And this is 2004, 2005. My wife inquired into, and by the way, my wife's name is Winona Single. She'll be giving a talk at the law school at noon. Winona asked for the materials from the Navajo Council on the legislative process, and one of the greatest things, I wish we had a copy of it. I put it up on PowerPoint. It was the legislative process. You guys remember the I'm Only a Bill from Schoolhouse Rock? It was like that, only it was the Navajo version. It was called Follow the Sheep. So that happened, and then we didn't really do much with it. There was really nothing to say. We had kids, and some of these projects fall by the wayside. But last year, a woman that I've actually met, incidentally, when I was in-house counsel at the Suquamish tribe, just showed up at a general council meeting and said, "Hey, let's adopt same-sex marriage. I want to marry my partner." Actually, I shouldn't say that. I don't think she even had a partner at the time. She just thought it was an interesting idea, and they just adopted it. And so there's this tribe, there's another tribe in Washington State whose name now suddenly escapes me, that has adopted same-sex marriage. And incidentally, my wife's tribe, the Little Traverse Bay Bands of Odawa Indians, are thinking about adopting it in Michigan. And incidentally, Winona drafted that statute, although it sat on the back burner for a good 10 years before it's going anywhere. So this is all being done sort of as a backdoor way of getting in, adopting same-sex marriage and making it more realistic in Indian country. It's all being done by women. Every single one of these instances is done by women. And I think that gives you a sense of where, where Indian women are and recovering their place, their accurate and important place in American Indian culture and governance. And you're now seeing in places, particularly in very rural Indian country or the desert Southwest, which seems really patriarchal, you're seeing Indian women being elected to leadership positions. And every now and then, if you follow, just that news headlines on Indians.com or something like that, you'll see almost invariably every couple of weeks another headline which is tribe elects first woman chairman or something like that. And I think that's a fantastic thing. So I'm going to conclude my remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions. And I apologize for speaking in generalities, but that's my middle name. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Our next speaker is Aisha Rahman, who's an attorney and is currently the executive director of an organization called Karama, which is Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. She serves as the head of that organization's family law division as well. Ms. Rahman came to Karama from Legal Aid of East Tennessee, where she was a staff attorney litigating cases on domestic violence. In her hometown of Knoxville, Tennessee, Ms. Rahman chaired the Social Justice Committee of the Shura, which was the consultative council at the Muslim community of Knoxville as well. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Rahman.
Thank you, Julie, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming today. I've been inspired this morning by what I heard on the first panel and actually have been jotting down a few additional notes. I'm changing my presentation a little because I've been inspired by what I heard. Let me tell you a little bit about Karama, because you may be wondering what we stand for. As Julie said, we are Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights, and the main thrust of our organization is to promote scholarship about the gender equitable principles of Islam. So what we are seeing, and especially in the realm of women's rights, what has happened, especially in the religious context, is that patriarchal interpretations of religious texts, especially the Quran and the example of the Prophet, have been propagated. And we are losing the essence of our faith, which is actually protecting and empowering women and women's rights. And so Karama attempts to promote scholarship. So we produce scholarship and we also post scholarship from various jurists and scholars, men and women, who write about the gender equitable principles of Islam and also specific issues within our communities that afflict women and just humans in general. So Karama, the word itself, means dignity in Arabic, and we derived our name from there's a verse in the Quran that says, God has given dignity to the children of Adam. So we know that that means both men and women, and we know that God has given dignity to us, and we're fighting to restore that dignity. Karama, so we address issues of domestic violence, and that's one of the main issues. There's two main issues that are affecting Muslim women, and those are financial rights and financial independence, and then, of course, domestic violence. At Karama, we have a Department of Justice grant. We talked a lot about VAWA this morning. We are one of the technical assistance providers under the VAWA grant. We provide trainings to trainers in Muslim communities about domestic violence in Muslim communities. So our trainings are specific to lawyers, advocates, judges, magistrates, anybody who may come across a Muslim woman or a Muslim man, because there are men that are victims of domestic violence, to talk about some of the cultural and religious issues that may come up in a domestic violence case. Prior to coming to Karama, I spent a few years litigating cases of domestic violence in a small town in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I was very surprised. My naivety was so deep that I didn't realize that there were a lot of Muslim women, even within our small southern community, that were victims of domestic violence. And one particular case that I will share with you, I think, was very illustrative of how domestic violence affects Muslim women, but shockingly, it was not, of course, exclusive to Muslim women. I had a client who is from Iraq. Her husband was from Iraq as well. He was a physician and was quite affluent and well respected in the community. She also was very educated. They fell in love. They got married in the UK. And they waited to register their marriage in Tennessee because they decided that he told her that if we're moving to Tennessee, we might as well register our marriage once we get into the United States. Well, she didn't know what that actually meant, and I didn't know what that actually meant until I did some research into this. The UK, and I'm not an expert on the law in the UK, but they have very specific laws about how to register a marriage. They're actually pretty archaic. You have to post the notice of marriage in a public place. You have to get a superintendent to sign off on the certificate, and needless to say, the woman did not know of all of these rules. I dare say that the man may not have known all the rules, but he knew that he wasn't following them. And they had a small religious ceremony at a home. And the imam, or the presiding person, assured them that they were doing everything legally. Well, she came to the United States, and shortly after coming to the U.S., she had a slew of issues. He was very abusive. He was verbally abusive to her, mentally abusive to her. He had actually secured for her a student visa. He was very intelligent. He didn't bring her as a spouse. He brought her as a student, and she was enrolled in classes. So there was no paper trail that these two were actually married, at least not anything that was legitimate. And we found out once the case went to court, I should add that she was pregnant at the time, and they found out that she was having a daughter, and he was very incensed at the fact that they were having a daughter. He did not want a daughter, he wanted a son. And he was so abusive that at one point during her pregnancy, the umbilical cord was around the baby's neck, and they were very concerned about whether the baby would shift. And he said, "Oh, this is great. The noose that is around her neck is what I've always wanted." She, needless to say, wanted to get divorced from this man. And once we went to court, the opposing counsel was able to do research on UK law and realize that their marriage was never legal. It has to be legal in the state that you have the marriage. And so there wasn't any marriage to register. They could have registered retroactively in Tennessee, but of course at that point he didn't want to. So this woman was left without any relief in court. She did not have, at that time there wasn't a criminal case. So with the U visa or the VAWA visa, you have to have a criminal case pending, and the district attorney actually has to sign off on the visa documents that there is a criminal case pending against the defendant, and that the victim is willing to participate in the prosecution. So if you have a civil case and you haven't reported it criminally, you are not, that relief is not available to you. So she didn't have security in terms of immigration. She was told that she didn't have a valid marriage, and so she comes from a culture and a religion where having sex outside of marriage is a sin and forbidden, and the court is telling her that she's had a child out of wedlock and that her child is illegitimate. He did not have to provide support to the child because he was providing support for a while, but when the marriage was deemed illegitimate, they have to go through genetic testing to establish paternity, which of course took some time, and he was delaying it as long as he could because he didn't want to actually pay. This case, to me, illustrated the complexity of the legalities of domestic violence. It's not as simple as getting her safety and protection. There were so many, it was like an onion. There were layers after layers of layers where this woman just needed protection on all levels. And of course, this man on the witness stand has the medical board saying that he's a doctor, he served our community, he's an educated man, he always showed up in a suit, he was very well spoken, and my client was, she spoke English, but not very well. She didn't have that social standing that our court system unfortunately looks to. And he got off without getting her protection. So regardless, I think that shows the legal aspect. I know this session is about the law, and so I wanted to shed some light on the complexity of the issues surrounding domestic violence. The last comment I will make is with regards to Muslim women in the U.S. and abroad. I will say that domestic violence has no cultural or religious face, as we heard in the last panel. Unfortunately, it's affecting all of our communities. I had in my Bible Belt time as a lawyer in Tennessee, I had a man come up to me and say, that he beat his wife because she wouldn't have sex with him. And I said, well, you don't have the right to do that. And he said, I do. She's my wife, and I'm a Christian man, and so I have the right to have sex with her. And I said, well, that may be the case, but you don't have the right to forcibly have sex with her. She is a person. She has a say in this. And so it's not exclusive, of course, to Muslims, and I'm not here to blame any faith system. I'm actually very respectful of faith. I think it's the misapplication and misinterpretation of people just wanting to further their own motives. But the main issues that are affecting Muslim women in the U.S. and abroad are their financial independence and then, of course, domestic violence. And Karama is attempting to bring to light the Islamic principles of women's rights, and I can talk to you guys more about it if you want to ask me questions, specifically what those are, and hopefully we'll have some success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisha. Our last speaker is Aram Shveh, who serves as Policy Counsel for Foreign Policy and Human Rights with the Center for Reproductive Rights in Washington, D.C., and he's responsible for advancing the center's international policy objectives. Before joining the center, he served as the supervising attorney and teaching fellow at the International Women's Human Rights Clinic at Georgetown University Law Center, where he supervised international human rights litigation, fact-finding investigations, and human rights report writing. From 2006 to 2008, Mr. Shveh served as litigation counsel at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, where he litigated a number of cases under the First Amendment's free exercise and establishment clauses. If you will please join me in welcoming Aram Shveh.
Thank you so much. It's really exciting to be here and have such a wonderful turnout. I'm going to just take 2 seconds just to get set up because I am high-techy and have a PowerPoint. So let's just, there we go. Is it still up? Okay. Sorry this isn't a little bit brighter, but hopefully people can see or, okay. Oh, good. It's up. Wonderful. Well, I'll just start and just say a few words about the Center for Reproductive Rights. We're an organization, international organization based in New York City, but we have offices in Washington, D.C., where I work, in Bogota, Colombia, Nairobi, Kenya. We're opening one in Kathmandu, and in Geneva, Switzerland. We use litigation and advocacy, so the courts and the legislatures, to advance women's reproductive rights, both in the United States, and we've actually been active all 50 states and the federal government, including here in Montana. We've been working in the past on SB 176 and SB 97, which people I think have been following. The governor has vetoed. One of them is coming up for a ballot initiative next year, and also all around the world. And we also use state courts, federal courts, the UN system, the regional system like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the European Union machinery, and so on. So the presentation that I'm going to give, I think, tries to marry a little bit some of the issues internationally and domestically, and sort of give a little bit of a primer on what the law is, what reproductive rights are, where their protections come from domestically and under international law, and what are the challenges that we're looking at in both those arenas. And I'll try to do that somewhat shortly, but if you can give a little knock or something, 2 minutes just so I don't go over. So let's begin at the beginning. What are reproductive rights? I think we all have a sense of what they might include, but it's good to have a simple definition. Luckily, there is such a definition. Reproductive rights rest on the recognition of the basic right of all couples and individuals, that's an important distinction, to decide freely and responsibly the number, spacing, and timing of their children, and to have the information and means to do so, and the right to attain the highest standard of sexual and reproductive health. This is a consensus statement from 1994 from the International Conference on Population and Development from Cairo, agreed upon by 179 countries, including this one. So this is sort of the gold standard understanding of what reproductive rights include. What does that mean in practice when we say reproductive rights? Well, we're looking at a number of different issues. First and foremost, I think on most people's minds, particularly in the United States, is abortion. And we'll talk substantially about that. Also, access to contraception is a big issue in the news these days, which carries over into insurance coverage. Not only is contraception legal, but is contraception actually available both on the open marketplace, but also through people's insurance plans. Comprehensive sex education. Pharmacy refusals, where pharmacists might refuse to honor or to prescribe medication that you have a valid prescription for based on religious beliefs. Forcible sterilization. Traditional harmful practices like female genital mutilation or female genital cutting. Policies in the workplace, for example, pregnant women coming back to work or not being able to take off work. And issues that we haven't really begun to address yet, like, for example, cloning. Take a sec. Okay. So why do reproductive rights matter? Obviously, there's a lot of different reasons why. Health. Reproductive rights are very closely tied to women's health and maternal health, and I'll talk about that a bit in my presentation. Not just women's health is at stake, but also in some cases, unfortunately, their very lives. A right to privacy, right? Individuals and couples' right to privacy. Human dignity is involved, economic security involved, and above all, equality is involved. Reproductive rights really obviously affect men and women. I'm a testament to that, hopefully. But fundamentally, because of biology as well as because of culture, fundamentally reproductive rights affect women in a qualitatively very different way, obviously, than men. I think Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice, said it really well in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, a 1992 Supreme Court case, when she said that the ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives. And I think it's no coincidence that the modern birth of birth control in the 1960s and 70s and early 80s is exactly the same time period where you have all these groundbreaking Supreme Court cases really advancing women's equality throughout the country. So women's rights are human rights. They're protected under the United States Constitution. This is a law panel, so a little bit of law is probably in order. Griswold versus Connecticut established a right of married couples to access contraception. Now, for many people in the audience, 1965 sounds like about a million years ago, but it's not, right? This is fairly recent history, relatively speaking. Eisenstadt versus Baird expanded that it wasn't just a marital right to contraception, but it was actually an individual right. Roe versus Wade, which of course everyone has heard of, the Supreme Court held, among other things, that abortion is a fundamental right. But Harris versus McRae in 1980 said that the government didn't have to take steps to actually make it affordable or accessible, that it sort of had to have a hands-off approach, but nothing to actually make that a reality. And Planned Parenthood versus Casey held that the government may not place undue burdens on abortion. Now, in contrast, in the United States, where really abortion and contraceptive rights are focused primarily on a right to privacy under the 14th Amendment, there, under international law, there's all sorts of places that it comes up. So it's guaranteed, and human reproductive rights have been found by the international treaty monitoring bodies, stemming from right to be free of discrimination, or right to equality, right to life, liberty, and security, a substantive right to health, the right to control number and spacing of children, the right to equality in marriage, to be free of torture, and the right to privacy. And these abbreviations underneath, are, for example, for the first one, since they repeat, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the United States is a state party to, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, and the new Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So just in short, the domestic versus international. In the United States, we have a focus on privacy, privacy, internationally we have many sources of rights. In the United States, the real emphasis is government has to be hands-off. The government can't put itself between you and an abortion clinic, or can't put itself between you and access to contraception, but it doesn't have to make it a reality. It doesn't have to help you afford it, doesn't have to help you pay for it, whereas internationally you have a much broader sense of duties. In the United States, the government has to respect the right. It shouldn't get in the way. But internationally, the government has to protect that right, meaning protect it from other people violating it, including third parties, including private actors. And that's something where the United States generally tends to differ. And finally, it must fulfill that right to a maximum of available economic resources, meaning that governments internationally have an affirmative obligation, not only to have a hands-off, but in fact a hands-on in making it a reality. I'll talk a little bit about two issues of probably greatest importance, abortion and contraception. I don't know how I am for time. Okay. On terms of domestically, I think, most people, I live in Washington, D.C. I actually live inside the Beltway. I, in fact, actually live in Washington, D.C. So this is stuff that I live, eat, and breathe. But I imagine that some of these discussions and debates and so on from the national media, and also some of the debates you're having internally in the Montana legislature, these things are coming up to the surface. So there's lots of threats domestically to abortion rights. Things like pre-viability bans. So the Supreme Court has held that basically the states can't have limit abortion pre-viability in general. And now more and more states are implementing what are called 20-week bans or earlier gestational limits, trying to push back to eliminate or prohibit abortion pre-viability. What we like to call trap laws, which are the targeted regulation of abortion providers, which are laws which are ostensibly neutral but basically aim to interfere with an abortion clinic's ability to operate. So in Virginia, for example, they passed some trap laws which require all sorts of abortion clinics to basically abide by some of the same standards as hospitals in terms of how high their ceilings are and how wide their hallways are and how many doors they have to have and what temperature it has to be inside and all these kinds of things that might make sense for a hospital but don't make sense for outpatient surgery and other kinds of surgeries that are outpatient, whether it's oral maxillofacial or whether it's plastic surgery, are of course not held to these same types of standards. Mandatory ultrasound laws, which we've heard both the sort of jelly on the belly type as well as the wand, right, the sort of invasive vaginal ultrasound that's being debated and discussed, which has no real medical basis, right? It's not the state is saying you have to do this whether or not you want it. Mandatory counseling, and in the worst cases, mandatory biased counseling that is not even in fact correct. Mandatory waiting periods where you have to, if you want to get an abortion, you have to come back 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours later. Bans from abortion coverage from private insurance and on the exchanges, which are sort of government insurance policies for those unable to get it on the private market through the Affordable Care Act. Funding bans is a huge one, right? There's going on with trying to defund Planned Parenthood, even though the vast majority of funding and the funding that it was getting from the federal government wasn't going to abortion at all. It was going to things like, breast cancer screenings and pap smears and so on. There are also existing funding bans right now. So for example, if you're a member of the Peace Corps, this is an issue I work on. If you're a member of the Peace Corps and you're raped, government will not pay for your abortion. If you're in the Peace Corps and you're a victim of incest, the government won't pay for your abortion. If you're in the Peace Corps and you will die if you don't have an abortion, you will die. The government will not pay a penny. Absolute funding ban in the Peace Corps. It's not like that other places. In other cases, usually in the government, it's life, rape, and incest, where the government will pay, at least theoretically. Restricting access to minors, I think that was the issue here in Montana in SB 97, where there are sort of parental notification laws and so on. This is also an issue that we're dealing with Plan B, emergency contraception. We're litigating that Plan B case against the federal government. Bans on particular procedures, bans on sex and so-called race-selective abortions, which I can talk about in the Q&A, and religious refusal laws where people are allowed to not provide certain services based on religious beliefs. 5 minutes? Okay. Religious refusal, for example, are where doctors and increasingly where hospitals and hospital corporations are allowed to say, we have a religious objection to doing X. Well, the problem is that those are generally not very well regulated. And in fact, there's some fantastic literature, it's not fantastic, it's very sad literature, peer-reviewed literature talking about how in Catholic hospitals, not just do they not perform so-called elective abortions, but in cases of miscarriage, or ectopic pregnancy, where Catholic hospitals will literally not do anything. Will put someone on an IV drip until the fetus dies. And in many cases that are documented, there's an article by a woman named Lori Friedman, women literally went septic, were hemorrhaging out of their eyes, had 107-degree fevers, and the doctors were not allowed to help them. So that's what that looks like. I think people get the sense of it's like, oh, a doctor doesn't want to perform an elective abortion, we shouldn't make him or her do that, and that may have a certain resonance, but these are largely unregulated and go far beyond, I think, what most people think they do. Internationally, we're dealing with total abortion bans. We're dealing right now, for example, the case in El Salvador where we're investigating and will probably represent the family of a woman, sadly the family of the woman, who had a miscarriage. And El Salvador has a total abortion ban, no exceptions. And she had a miscarriage, and instead of being taken to a hospital for emergency treatment, she was suspected of having had an illegal abortion and was thrown in jail. She didn't get proper medical care, and she died. There are also places where you have near total bans. So one of the cases we worked is in Peru. We represented a young girl named Elsie. Elsie was raped repeatedly by her neighbor starting at age 11. At age 13, she got pregnant and and couldn't get an abortion because they were illegal in Peru. And then tried to commit suicide, jumped off of a building, and became paralyzed. Then the doctors refused to operate on her, which they could have done to restore her mobility because she was pregnant and because operating on her might harm the fetus. So that's one of the cases we took up. Now, at the UN system, the Human Rights Committee held that that was a violation of her international human rights, but that's the kind of system we live in. Ambiguous laws. In Uganda, for example, it says that abortions are always prohibited unless they're lawful. Doesn't say when it is lawful. And increasingly, U.S.-style restrictions are cropping up that we're actually exporting. In fact, U.S. groups and U.S. lawmakers are busy trying to pass in other countries laws they can't get through in this one, like mandatory counseling. A broad look, though, if you look overall, you can see the countries in the north are green, which have the most permissive abortion laws. The countries with darker shades of orange and red have the more restrictive ones. And you can really see there is a very strong north-south disparity. I'll say that just talk, and just tell me how much. 2 minutes? Okay. About the link between abortion access and maternal mortality. Maternal mortality is the second leading cause of death worldwide of women of reproductive age, that is between 15 and 44. 13% of maternal deaths are caused by unsafe abortions. 98% of those took place in developing countries that have restrictive abortion laws. And the CEDAW committee, the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, has held, as of many other committees, that abortion restrictions can be a violation of the right to life of its women. How does the U.S. compare? The U.S. is 50th worldwide in maternal mortality. That means 49 countries have better maternal mortality ratios. The maternal mortality ratio in the United States has doubled. It's gotten a lot worse for the last 20 years. African American women 4 times more likely to die of maternal causes, and no change in that number for the last 20 years. U.S. births are 5 times more dangerous than in Greece, 4 times more dangerous in Germany, and of course there's regional discrepancies. Washington, D.C., 30 times more dangerous for women than Maine. So anyway, let's see, I'll just go briefly through contraception. Why is it important? Most women want 2 children. They're sexually active for 30 years, so it either means they're going to really do a lot of abstaining for most of that time, or they have to use contraception. Cost remains a big barrier, especially for long-acting reversible contraception. Half of pregnancies in the United States are unintended. And there's a health impact of unintended pregnancies on the woman, and if the pregnancy is taken to term, which it is, but only for 57% of the time, for the child. The domestic kinds of threats, affordability and coverage. I've been working extensively on the religious refusal issue about contraceptive copays and the sort of outcry from the Catholic bishops. I'm happy to answer questions about the litigation. There are 9 different lawsuits that have been brought, including one by a group of state attorneys general. I've been sort of in my ears up to that, so if people want to talk a little bit about what the case law is on the constitutional side or on the statutory side, I'm happy to do that. The conflation of emergency contraception and abortion. Emergency contraception is birth control. It is not an abortifacient, but that doesn't stop folks from constantly repeating the disproven and scientifically not accurate statement that it is. Access for minors and personhood bills like the one that was defeated in Mississippi that would have defined a person as a union of a sperm and egg. And again, the religious refusal laws. Internationally, we have the same kinds of issues in terms of quality, as well. So just summarizing, in terms of the threats, abortion, the legal threats include these gestational limits, limits on grounds, personhood laws, and unrestricted religious refusal clauses. In addition to legal threats, there's access threats of availability, affordability, threats to providers, biased counseling. And on contraception, the kinds of legal threats, legal restrictions, and bans in particular forms, including emergency contraception, though that's generally legal in most places, and then access threats as well. And that is all. All right. Was it really? Okay.
Thank you very much, Aram. And now we have the opportunity to hear questions from all of you. So we have a microphone going around. I see the first question already. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for coming today, and thanks to Terry and the Center for putting this on. This is for Ms. Rahman. Dealing with domestic violence in Muslim families seems like a difficult thing. And the question I want to ask you is, how do you respond when they say, well, the Quran is very clear, it says expressly that after a series of steps, I, the husband, may physically discipline my wife?
Thanks for the question. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. I knew this was going to come up. It always comes up in the context of domestic violence, especially with regards to Muslims. There is a verse in the Quran, chapter 4:34 is what you're referring to, which says that if your wife is, roughly translated, I think, disobedient, which has been interpreted to mean that she is unfaithful, then you first talk to her about it, and you consult with her, and if that doesn't work or stop the behavior, you then separate from her in bed, that you leave her in bed. This can be interpreted to be in separate bedrooms or whatnot in the modern context. And then third, it actually uses a word, daraba, in Arabic, that says, then hit her. Of course, to anyone who does domestic violence, and even someone who doesn't do domestic violence, this is a very problematic verse. Daraba, many scholars have said that it does not mean to hit in this context. It means to separate from, as in divorce. Daraba, like in any language, Arabic has lots of shades of meaning to various words. Several scholars have said there's actually 37 meanings to the word daraba. That's one scholarly opinion. Another scholarly opinion is that when the Prophet, peace be upon him, was told to illustrate what this means, he actually had a stick, and it said, tap her like this. Well, again, to someone who does domestic violence, even a symbolic tapping is problematic. What does that actually mean? What are you disciplining her like a child? I would say, and the way that I have reconciled this, because I'm very fond of my religion and of the text, is we know that the Prophet Muhammad was our example, and he was a walking Quran. That's how we knew him to be. He was the manifestation of all that God intended for us. And he was confronted with an issue of a potentially disobedient wife. Actually, my namesake is Aisha, who was a wife of the Prophet. And I'll tell a quick story. The story is that she was young, she was flighty and feisty, and she dropped a necklace when she was traveling in the desert, and she left her caravan to go and seek this necklace. And when she went back to where they were parked, the people weren't there anymore, and so she was lost. And a man came to her in the desert and offered to take her back to her people, and so she agreed. And when she came back on the back of a camel with this strange man who clearly was not the prophet, and everyone knew who she was, people started slinging gossip and saying, well, there must be something inappropriate going on between the two of you. And of course, the rational explanation is that if you're alone with a man, you must be having sex with him. So she was very incensed at this accusation, because she, of course, was chaste and didn't have an inappropriate relationship with this man. And so she separated herself from the situation and said, I'm going to my parents' house, and when you're ready to talk, we'll talk. And the narration, I believe, is that the prophet went to her and said, did you? And she said, no. And that was the end of it. And if he is our prophet and he is our example when confronted with this issue of a potentially disobedient wife, he didn't beat her. He didn't even separate from her bed. She separated herself. He merely consulted with her. And I think that to me shows us that even if there was some discussion surrounding this punishment, the prophet never enacted that, and we're to follow his example. That's how I justify it to myself. I say that they're wrong. I think that there are many, many scholars of Islam who have said very clearly and explicitly that domestic violence, it has no place in Islam. And we all know, anyone who does work in domestic violence knows that people aren't engaging in a discussion of scholarly texts and context. They're acting first and rarely asking questions later. The beating or the abuse comes before any of these issues ever come to face. So I think that I know that domestic violence is prohibited in Islam, and every other verse, you picked out the one verse that everyone wants to talk about, but the majority of the Quran that talks about relations between spouses especially is to show that there is supposed to be love and mercy and affection and tranquility between two spouses. And we all know that if you look at it in the totality, that means that you need to be living without violence, of course, with spouses.
Well, thank you. I thought that I noticed another hand for questions. No? Okay, thank you. Terry?
Thank you. Matthew, you seem to portray a situation in which there's a return to a more fundamental system of justice in the tribes. But I think a lot of the rest of us think that women's equality and women's rights, including reproductive rights, are increasingly under attack, not just in the United States, but globally. And I wanted to ask maybe all of you if this perception is true, or is it just that there's increasing necessary focus? And if it is true, if things have worsened in recent years, to what do you ascribe that?
I'm sorry. All right, you said my name, so I actually had a response to the previous question. There's the story for Michigan Indians that everybody tells is if there's a problem between a couple, it's up to the wife, to the woman, to break it off. And usually and we're so passive aggressive. What we do is, well, what she does is, a guy comes home from work and he sees his shoes on the back porch. He knows it's over. and that used to mean something incredibly profound, and all of that is lost now. To answer your question, I think that the necessary focus, there is more and more focus. There is a group it's a depressing focus, right? I mean, the fact that we have to talk about these things. There's a group at Michigan State University College of Law of students called the Modern Abolitionist Movement Law Society, and they invited some speakers, and just in literally the last year or two, some federal and state law enforcement agencies have begun to focus on human trafficking out of Indian country, through Indian country, and some of these stories are just beyond horror. And does this mean things are getting worse and worse? I don't know. The fact that we're talking about it, I think, is the first, like, what is that, the first step on the road to recovery or something. And so it's moving, right? And you know, I tell you, I saw a lot of people shaking their heads, kind of annoyed, or, you know, kind of disgusted by cases like Santa Clara Pueblo versus Martinez. But, you know, 200-300 years of Indian people giving up their, you know, their right to govern themselves to outsiders has created this problem, and it's only through the restoration of tribal, I hate to call it, I don't even like the word, but tribal sovereignty, tribal governance really, and tribal culture is this going to change. So the answer to your question is yes. How's that?
Do we want to go to Arm, who hasn't spoken to a question yet, or then Aisha, or how? You go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually just going to, since we have apparently a paucity of questions, I was just going to respond actually quickly to sort of piggyback on the answer that you gave, and then maybe just the question of sort of, is it getting worse in terms of the, you know, the war on women and so on. You know, I think what you said struck me in terms of the role of religion. I mean, I think that can really be an important moderating role. When I was teaching in law school, I actually, there was a student in a class who was, and I'm not making this up, was a self-described former member of the Taliban. You know, from Afghanistan, and, you know, the kind of, you know, we had always been taught at the madrasa that this means blah, 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 and then sort of having that, you know, becoming more educated and learning that there's sort of different interpretations of religious texts and stuff makes a huge difference. We deal with that in the reproductive rights context all the time. One of the organizations that we work with quite a bit is called Catholics for Choice, and it's an organization of people who are Catholic, but who are able to reconcile a pro-choice perspective with biblical beliefs. And I think that that's really important for reaching more people. I will say, though, to step back, that where there's, I mean, you know, religious texts are very old and they're very ambiguous and they can mean a lot of things, right? I mean, the Old Testament countenances, you know, killing your children if they're disrespectful and having slaves and all these kinds of things. And you can interpret that to mean, you know, symbolic death of the children, but at some level, you know, where there is a real conflict between a religious belief or religious practice and human rights have to trump. I mean, that's the basis of the U.S. Constitution, right? It's not a Christian nation. This is not a religious nation, right? There are a nation with many religious people in it, but we have secular civil laws. And internationally, that's true. There's an international right to conscience and religious belief and religious exercise, but only to the extent that that doesn't affect or you know, detract from other people's enjoyments of all of their rights. So, I mean, I think it's great to try to be able to accommodate you know, human rights within the framework of religious belief, and I think you can bring a lot more people into the fold that way, but I do think that you know, if push comes to shove, you have to go with the human rights angle. In terms of the question about, you know, is it really getting worse, you know, I haven't been at the center that as long as a lot of other people have, but my understanding from what everyone says is yes. There really is kind of a ferocity of attacks on abortion rights. Now it's shifted back from there to contraception and sort of relitigating and re-problematizing things that really were settled you know, in the 1950s and 60s. If you look at what the Senate, especially in the House, has been doing, because I go to the House, you know, every week, and every day we're talking about some kind of new restriction on abortion. It's, you know, interstate trafficking of interstate, you know, Minors Notification Act. It's the Prenatal Non-Discrimination Act. It's a 20-week ban for this. It's, you know, it's ban on telemedicine. I mean, you know, the number of abortion bills versus the number of job bills is sort of staggering. And you look at what's going on in the states and overseas and you know, and the same people who are pushing all these bills are also uninterested in other women's rights issues, right? Like the Lilly Ledbetter Act, or Pay Equality Act, or the Equal Rights Amendment, or now the Violence Against Women Act. So it's really not just about abortion, and it's not even just about abortion and contraception. It's really just about all these issues down the line. As to why, I don't know. I mean, I think it's a reactionary sort of fervor. There's sort of religious push behind it in the United States and a lot of other countries. I don't know.
Aisha, did you want to respond? Okay, all right. Oh, yes, a question. Did you see one? Okay. Oh, good. We have a bunch now.
I was wondering if you could talk about Islam's view of reproductive rights, and if either of you deal with that either at Karama or where you, what was the place? Sorry, that you. The Center for
Reproductive Rights.
Yeah, rights. If you,
www.reproductiverights.org.
if you deal with the issue of different religious views, like you were talking about Catholics for pro-choice and different religious views on reproductive rights.
Sure. Well, I'll also plug my organization. If you go to karama.org, there's actually an article by our founder, Aziza El-Hibri, called The Introduction to Women's Rights. And I think that it has a whole section regarding female reproductive rights and just reproductive rights in general, and contraception and Islam. And actually, and this is not my forte, but I can speak to it a little bit. Islam, with the advent of Islam, it was revealed in a time of ignorance in Arabia, where there was a lot of female infanticide. There was a lot of violations of women's rights in general. Women were often slaves. They were very much second-class citizens. And with the advent of Islam, all of a sudden there were these quite drastic laws or verses of the Quran that were revealed to the Prophet that were actually very women-friendly, including Islam, especially with regards to sexual rights, is very open-minded. While we want to focus a lot on the fact that Muslims are not supposed to have sex outside of marriage, as most religions believe, once you are in marriage or in a legal setting, where sex is allowed, there's actually verses in the Quran that say that women have a right to pleasure, as do men, and women have the right to have children and want and can not demand but ask for that of her husband to help her in providing children, as do men. So it's a mutuality of right. Also, as far as contraception is concerned, Islam has never had an issue with family planning and contraception. In fact, during the Prophet's time, there was a lot of discussion about contraception, and I'm not going to get into the vulgar details, but there were forms of contraception that were practiced at that time that the Prophet knew about, and he thought it was fine, never said anything about it. It was good. Because, well, that's all I'll say about that. But, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just also respond. Yeah, I mean, the work that we've done reaching out with religious groups has been primarily in the United States, where obviously the major, are the Christian denominations, and especially Roman Catholicism. In terms of internationally, I mean, if abortion is illegal and for virtually every reason, in some cases for any reason, including to save the life of the mother, in a number of countries that are majority Islamic. There's some variation. So countries, Jordan and Morocco, are, as you might expect, are a little bit more liberal, and countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and Iran are more conservative on that. So I mean, that's politically, that's not necessarily based on an understanding of Islam, although many of the countries derive at least some of their legal backgrounds from Islam. But things are changing. I mean, for example, in 2008, emergency contraception became legal in Morocco. Now, that's much later than it's been legal other places, but it still is some progress, but it is certainly slow in that part of the world. And it's also a harder part of the world because many of those countries, I mean, Saudi Arabia, Iran, so on, are very closed, and it's very difficult for an organization that's not a domestic group, if even a domestic group, to get sort of political traction and organize and have strong civil society in the way that you do in other places.
All right, thank you. I think there were a couple questions over on that side.
Thank you. This is more actually just a statement of, I used to run a domestic and sexual violence program in rural Montana for 15 years and decided to go back to school. And one of the research I'm looking on is also the correlation between abortion and domestic violence. and that there's a high percentage of women who have abortions that are also victims of domestic violence. And part of my research is looking at the impact of all these laws against contraception and abortion, of how many victims of domestic violence are going to be trapped in relationships, because we know pregnancy is one reason that women stay, because of the financial support, the father, and all those interests. And I'm just wondering, have you guys worked on that issue at all, or?
Yeah, I mean, we have somewhat, but that's sort of, it's another problem. I mean, it's absolutely true, and it's sort of it's both a cause and an effect, sort of a vicious circle. Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've looked at, and it's yet another problem with some of these laws, and especially when you look at access to contraception and unintended pregnancies. You know, there's good news and there's bad news, and then there's really bad news. The good news is that unintended pregnancy rates have gone down about 29% among those at twice the poverty rate or more. The bad news is that the unintended pregnancy rates have gone up by 50-something% in those below that level of income. And, you know, so that's a real problem when and those groups are where you have the kind of economic necessity that leads women to stay in situations that they otherwise might not feel, compelled to stay in.
Matthew or Aisha, did either of you want to comment? Thank you. And there was another question right there.
Hi. This is a little more global question. Don't mean to direct it at Aisha, but kind of piggybacking on Terry's question. Mona Eltawahi just wrote an important essay on it called "Why Do They Hate Us?" And she was questioning the Arab Spring. And I guess I would ask, do you feel optimistic about women in those countries, or less than optimistic?
Thank you. Well, as anyone who's doing work in this field, my pat answer would have to be that I, of course, am optimistic. I'm trying to be, at least. We have to keep trying. As far as the Arab Spring, there's a lot of discussion about women's rights because of the Arab Spring. What we are seeing, what I found very interesting, is that a lot of publicity in the media was focusing on how many women took to the streets, especially in Egypt at the very beginning. And I just found it interesting that people were so surprised that Muslim women would take to the streets, as if that's such a novel concept. Anyone who has traveled to Egypt, you see a lot of women on the street. It's not that women aren't out and about. So I thought that, right then there was a shift in focus, and then a lot of the social media that we saw at the time of the Arab Spring with the tweeting and the blogging was coming from women who were talking about their rights and fighting for their rights. But then, of course, so that was good. And then we saw that women were being beaten up in the streets, and they were being subjected to virginity tests. And it was very odd, why is that happening, and why, this convergence of, on the one hand, we're seeing women who are vociferous and fighting and arguing for a regime change and their rights, and then we also are seeing them, unfortunately, at the hands of mostly men, being victimized again. We're seeing that as the Arab Spring, of course, has shifted from beyond Egypt and into Libya, et cetera, we're seeing that a lot of women are taking Karama's model of education of women's rights. I think what we're seeing a lack of in the Arab world and the Muslim world, even in the US, is this lack of education about your rights within Islam. So I think that we have our work cut out for us. And actually a lot of these, I talked about the patriarchal interpretations of the religion. They're forces that are working against us. They don't want to hear our message, which is that when you're armed with, tenets of the faith, and you're fighting and you're saying, hey, look, this is where it says this is not okay. This is where it says, we have rights to work and to have education and our financial independence, et cetera. That's not popular for people who want to remain in power, for men who want to maintain power. So it's a matter of optimism. I can hope that education will spread. I think that with more women knowing their rights, and the quicker we can get the message out, it may be good, but it may take a while. It may not be during our lifetime. I hope so.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Itzel Jarger, and I'm a PhD student here at the university, and I work on issues related to feminicide. And one of the topics that I'm interested in is like when there is violations of women's rights, it not just affect women, which are 50% of the population, and the mothers of the other 50%. How do we include the other 50% in this discussion? And in terms of reproductive rights, how women, for example, are discriminated when they're pregnant or for pregnancy because of the maternity leave. So I would like to know from the panelists, what are the strategies, what do you know in your experience that have been effective to do, for example, to promote paternity leaves, to include them in these rights, so they feel entitled to the same fight? And if you have anything to say about it. And I actually would like to know from the indigenous perspective and from the Islamic perspective. And well, I didn't mean to say 2 questions, but I'm also interested in how women that know under Islam have been fighting with their own strategies and with their own thoughts against female genital mutilation, for example, that I think it's a form of feminicide. I'm from Mexico, and we have a huge problem with the killing of women for being women. So.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure which one of you wants to begin.
Okay, I can start. So with regards to your first question and getting men involved in the conversation, I have been very disheartened, actually, in my time at Karama by the lack of male participation in the discussion. As I addressed in the first question, or the question immediately prior, I think educating women about their rights is very important, but if the men are unaware of those rights, unfortunately, they're the oppressors, and if they don't know, how are we going to tackle these issues? Women can fight till they're blue in the face for their rights, but men need to be receptive to it as well. And I think especially within the Muslim community, as a single woman, and looking at all my other single Muslim friends who are in their 30s and 40s are having trouble finding good men, we have a challenge within our community to really try to educate men and try to bring men out of either, there's a slew of issues. I won't even go into them, not even a misunderstanding of rights, but a slew of issues that our community is facing in this educating of our sons and men and future husbands. So in terms of that, all I can do is try to encourage men to participate in the conversation. There are a few, but we can look around today and see that there's majority women here, even at this conference. It's a global issue, not only, of course, exclusive to Islam or Muslims. Your second question was about female genital mutilation. One thing that's very important to address in this forum is the difference between religion and culture. And I think that what we see a lot of is a religion, or the religious text may say one thing, but the culture that's been handed down for generations and generations promotes something else. And unfortunately, female genital mutilation, as we call it, other people think it's a rite of passage in certain countries, and it's celebrated and it's commemorated. And, it's a very fine line that you have to walk when you're saying to someone that their culture is wrong, or that their culture is inappropriate. I think that Islamically, there's no precedence for female genital mutilation, and a lot of scholars will say that we shouldn't be doing this, and it takes away from that pleasure aspect that I talked about before. You know, if Islam celebrates, you know, a woman's right to experience pleasure and harmony with her spouse, then why is there this contradiction? But again, what we see, and this is probably true of all religions and cultural values, is that cultural values are then imposed as religious values. And we have to be very careful about challenging those cultural practices, because they are mischaracterized as religion.
All right.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question in terms of all of them, so I'll try to do my best to address them. In terms of including men, I mean, I think hopefully, you know, I see it as an issue that affects men, right? I mean, there are no pregnancies that do not involve a man at some level of the relationship, and men are obviously greatly affected by it. Whether it's, you know, your spouse or your girlfriend or your sister or your mother or your friend, you know, men are obviously greatly affected by women's ability to have children when they want to, and that being protected. Just my mother texted me about 2 minutes before I went up saying that there's a case now in Indiana where a female teacher at a Catholic high school was fired because she underwent IVF. So ability to have children if you want them, or ability to not have children. And so, you know, I think having me helps. I like, you know, talking to other men about the issue. I think it's really important. But in terms of, you know, going beyond that, and you mentioned about paternity leave, I mean, you know, heck, we don't have maternity leave. You know, my wife works for the federal government. You know, she gets 0 days of maternity leave. You know, I work for a private NGO organization. I will get, you know, over 10 weeks of paternity leave. So, you know, it's organizations have to lead by example, but I mean, the United States record on this is just awful all the way around. And on FGM, I mean, I think it's a really interesting issue, right? Because it's an issue that has been justified with reference to Islam, but it's also been justified with reference to Christianity. And it's also been referenced and justified with reference to animist beliefs. So I think Aisha's point is exactly right, that people justify it based on an ambiguous teaching or an interpretation of one, but that isn't necessarily where it comes from. And there's a tremendous amount of variety of what kind of FGM, so there's 4 levels, right? And so in Sudan, for example, people have more of a full FGM, pharaonic excision, versus in Egypt, where it's very, very common, but it's less is taken off, I guess to say. And it also inverts some other kinds of understandings that we have. I mean, Aisha mentioned sort of men as being oppressors, and in the context of domestic violence, that's almost always true. In the case of FGM, it's oftentimes women who are the ones who are carrying forward this tradition. And I think how to address it is a really tough issue. It's very easy to sort of come in from the West and say, oh, that's barbaric, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, you're uncivilized and you should get with the program. And, you know, there's a document that we wrote in Geneva that says you can't do it anymore. So there. You know, that, and it not necessarily being a priority for people in that country, right? There's a whole dynamic that I think one of the people in the Law Review wrote about how you had these sort of white Western feminists who are focusing on FGM and women feminists in these countries who are focusing on like getting access to water. You know, or like food. So I think that's an issue, although now increasingly I think there are a lot of activists who are from in-country and can speak from within that cultural context, as Aisha's group tries to do, to combat it. And I think also how we respond, right? I think, you know, we can say that it's a human rights violation, which it is, which it's been held to be, which the WHO classifies as, and so on. But then how do you address it? Does that mean that we lock up, you know, women who do that to their daughters? Do we lock up chiefs in villages who don't stop it? I think some of the most effective work that's being done is an organization called TOSTAN, T-O-S-T-A-N. If you want to talk to me afterward, I know someone there I can put you in touch with if you're interested in this issue, because I've done some work on it. And they do work on really trying to get communities to abandon the practice voluntarily and to undergo some other sort of symbolic rite of passage, whether it's, you know, painting something on a daughter's face or taking them to sort of a separate part of the community where they teach her, you know, what it is being a woman and this and that, but not necessarily, you know, having the clitoris excised and the, you know, labia sewn shut. Right, so I think that there are different ways of kind of addressing this, and I think, you know, the education and trying to get groups to abandon the practice is in the long run much more effective than sort of some kind of half-baked law to criminalize it to placate people in the West, which is usually what happens certainly in sub-Saharan Africa. That's my experience.
And Matthew, would you be able to speak to I guess probably the first part of the question in terms of American Indians and efforts to bring men into the broader conversation?
There certainly are efforts. I would just add that I've worked in-house for 4 different Indian tribes, and I know quite a bit about some of the tribes in Michigan, and our paternity and maternity leave is pretty good. And I think that there's a very strong sense politically in the vast majority of Indian country that supports particularly the rights of children, and I think those often go hand in hand with rights of women. So there is a very good, there's a lot of good public policy and tribal statutes out there that are stronger than you would see in most other places, certainly when you say the federal government, good Lord. So, you know, and we do a pretty good job, I think, and things are getting better in that way, and that's, you know, it's a place where tribal sovereignty has worked, and so things are improving, but you know there are still there's still a lot of work to be done, surely, in many areas of Indian country.
Well, I want to thank all of you for attending this session today. Our next one begins at 1:45 in this same room, and if you could all please join me for thanking our very excellent panelists.